Welcome back to Refit and So. My name's George Isted, the Silent Boat Butler. This is a Contessa 32, which is getting a fairly extensive refit with me over this winter. In earlier videos, you will have seen an osmosis treatment. You would have seen me ripping out the floor, the water tank, putting a new water tank and floor in, and the work continues this week whilst I'm waiting for materials to finish the floor by taking out the engine and doing a whole load of work in the engine bay and down the back of the boat. If you watched my earlier videos, you will know that I have already taken the prop shaft out and the stern tube on this boat. It's getting a new stern tube. But whilst the stern tube was out, I also noticed that the foam that is in the top of the skeg is still damp, and I was unable to dry that out as part of the osmosis treatment. The only way I can access it to remove it is to get in to the top of the skeg, which is behind the engine, right at the back of the engine bay, in a really tight corner. So I'm going to be taking the engine out. That's simply a matter of disconnecting all the cables, the diesel fuel lines, the exhaust is already off, and then I'm going to pull that forward onto the step, which has been newly fitted, and I'm going to put some protective wood over the top of that to stop it from being damaged. And then I can hoik the engine out. I've already made some temporary engine beds on a pallet, so I can drop the engine directly onto a pallet, bolt it down, stick it in the van and take it round to the workshop. Whilst the engine's out, I'm probably going to give it a bit of a once over, just because it's easier to do that with the engine out than it back in. There are some other jobs I need to do whilst I'm in the engine bay. There's no access hatch from the cockpit locker, and all the later boats have an access hatch. Early boats like this don't, so I'm going to make an access hatch just to make getting into the back of the engine much easier. I'm also going to be refitting the new stern tube and painting the engine bay. I'm going to be putting sound insulation in there because there isn't any, and a few other bits and pieces while I'm at it. So keep watching if you want to see all that happening over the next week or so. Here's the engine in the engine bay. It is looking a little bit dusty and dirty, but under that dust, which I've created with the works that I've been doing, there is a nice clean Yanmar 2GM. Now, from what I can gather, it starts and runs perfectly well. There's no reason to replace that as part of the refit that we're doing. So I'm going to start disconnecting that, and then I can pull it forward and hoik it out. That's most of the engine disconnected, so the fuel is done, the controls are done. The only thing I've just got to do is unbolt the power and earth strap, which one goes onto the starter motor. Kind of round the back there you can see a red cable, and the ground or the negative goes onto the back of the block back there, so that's just two bolts I need to pull out. So a couple of observations. The fuel that came out of the fuel filter is a little bit grotty. There's quite a lot of stuff floating around in that, so I think it might be prudent to drain the fuel tank down at some point before we reconnect all this up. The other thing as a top tip is so that you don't get dirt in the engine, what I tend to do is I take the flexi fuel hose off of the fuel filter, which was here, the primary fuel filter, and I remove the fuel return off of the injector, which is back here, and I put the hose onto the fuel return. So effectively the fuel return is connected to the fuel inlet on the lift pump, which is kind of back there. So that way you've covered both the inlet and the outlet for the fuel on the engine, and it just means that there's less chance of getting dirt and muck up inside those fuel fittings. So here's the engine out of the hole. It didn't take too much persuasion to get out, just unbolted the flexi mounts and slid it forward. I've got the sump sitting on a block of wood on top of the step there. Unfortunately, I kept the old template, so I could put the old template for the step on top of the step just to protect the wood. Now, to lift it out, there are a couple of lifting eyes. So there's one kind of just there, there's another lifting eye just there, so we can put a strap between those two and then hook the engine onto the crane, and then we can pull it out. It's not a particularly heavy engine. I can manhandle that one in and out of the hole quite easily, and if you really wanted to at a push, you could put a block and tackle on the boom and then pull the engine up out of the hatch using that. But Given that I don't have a mast, I definitely don't have a boom, and I'm going to use the yard guys have got a telly hoist, so we're going to pull that in, lift the engine up and stick it in the trailer. And just like that, the engine is out. I've strapped it down. I've also screwed it down to those engine bearers that are stuck on top of a pallet, so that is all going to be pretty secure. And it's just started raining, so I'm going to go undercover, and after lunch I can take that around the workshop and dump it there securely, or I can do a bit of work to it on a rainy day. And here you can see an empty engine bay. It is pretty grot in there, and if I angle the camera correctly you can see right outside the boat there, so that hole there is where the stern tube will get glassed back in due course. But before I can do that, I'm going to be removing that back bulkhead. You can see right at the back there it's glassed in on the sides and the bottom, and with that out I'll be able to access the area behind it and get to not only the seacocks, or where the seacocks will be when I refit them, but also the top of the skeg. So I'm going to cut a hole in the top of the skeg where it's been glassed over and get to that wet foam, remove all that foam and replace it in due course. But first I've got to remove some of this old kind of foam lining. There isn't really much in the way of engine sound insulation, but there was a bit of foam in there. It's kind of dirty, disgusting stuff, slightly blackened, and that's all going to get removed. I'm also in the process of cutting an access hatch through that side there. I'll show you that from the cockpit. One of the things that all the later Contessas have that the early boats like this one don't is an access hatch from the cockpit locker down there into the engine bay. So I am just cutting an access hatch now, but I can't completely remove that hatch at the moment because that bulkhead's in the way, and this access hatch kind of straddles that bulkhead. You can probably see there I've started cutting that access hatch right about there in the middle. About there is that bulkhead, so I've got to chop out that bulkhead, then I'll be able to get that area I've cut to release, and that will allow me access into the engine bay when the engine goes back in. It'll also allow far easier access into the seacocks. So you can see I've cut it just above the glass tabbing which holds that piece of plywood into the hull, and again I've cut it just below the tabbing which bonds that plywood into the side of the cockpit. So strength wise it's not a problem. All the new boats have it with an access hatch, so I don't think that's going to cause any issues structurally to the boat. Progress has been made. I've managed to chop out that bulkhead that was at the back there. You can still see a little bit of the tabbing there, which I'm going to remove in a minute. So here's the bulkhead that's just been removed. Hopefully I can stick that back in, although it's tempting to make a new one because the old one didn't quite reach up to the bottom of the cockpit floor, so I might extend it with a new bulkhead possibly. That area there is immediately above the skeg, but what I'm going to do next is go outside and just have a quick measure up, measuring forward from the rudder tube, and the rudder tube's that thing sticking up, and I will then be able to work out roughly where I need to cut to access the top of the skeg. What you may also have noticed is there's a big hole there, so that hatch that I partially cut out yesterday with the bulkhead removed, I could pop that fully out. So I now have reasonably good, I'm not going to say it's good, but you know, certainly much better than it was, access to the seacocks, which I've got to fit in there. There's no seacocks currently because they were removed as part of the osmosis treatment. Yeah, that's going to make life for future owners and anyone working on this boat in the future much, much easier. I'm afraid that working in a confined space means it's very difficult for me to record and work at the same time. But what you can possibly see up there is I've just cut round kind of a triangle shape off the bonding over the top of the skeg there.
and I'm hoping that I can get a screwdriver in and start kind of levering this off whilst holding a camera, which is not very, very easy. I'm afraid there isn't a way of holding a camera in this tight little space and filming at the same time, but there was a layer of glass over here, so that came off fairly easily, and I found some absolutely soaking wet plywood, which is just, you know, falling to pieces. And then under that, we have the foam, which is also obviously wet. Now, I know this isn't smelly vision, but it is a bit stinky, it has to be said. So I'm just going to carry on pulling all of that wood out and then see if I can chop that foam out. I'm expecting it will come out in mini pieces. So, but it's got to come out, so I'm going to crack on. If you're under any impression that what I do is glamorous in any way, it has to be said today is not one of those days. It is stinky, it's horrible, it's uncomfortable, and I'm kind of earning my money today. Here's a chunk of the foam that I've just kind of removed, and you can see it's wet. There's absolutely no way I was going to be able to dry this. In fact, if I squeeze it, you can see it's just full of water. So obviously not closed cell foam, whatever it was that was used back in the day, absorbs water. So if you have a leak around the stern tube, getting that foam dry is a very, very difficult job, unless you do what I'm doing, which is not exactly pleasant, but it ensures that that skeg is completely dry. With only a small amount of swearing, I have managed to get all the horrible old foam out of the void down there. So I appreciate the light is not very good, but that is it, all clear of foam. Right down the bottom there, the foam was absolutely soaking wet. In fact, there was a pool of water right at the very bottom of that void. It was never going to dry out, so I'm quite pleased that we've done that now. I think as a next step, I'm very tempted, because it's salt water and that's really never going to dry out properly, I'm going to go and get a bucket of water with a bit of detergent in it and just wash out that void to remove any traces of salt in there. And then if I leave some heating running in here overnight, then that will help everything dry out before I bond in the new stern tube. And I also need to order the new foaming epoxy, which is what I'm going to be filling that void with once it's all dry. Whilst I've got good access, I'm going to be replacing these cockpit drains. So one of the issues that you get on these old Contessas is they use fairly dissimilar metals underneath the deck here, with the different elbows and bits and pieces. So I'm just going to chop these out and replace them with some nice new DZR skin fittings. Sometimes the easiest way is just to kind of cut slots in the top flange of the skin fitting, or in this case the cockpit drain, and then I can get a screwdriver under there and just break off each of these individual sections, and the whole thing will then just drop through. And that's definitely much easier than struggling with the backing nut, which has been on there for donkey's years. Now, I don't know what the sealant was that was on this old fitting, but it was like grease, to be honest with you. It wasn't anything that set. I don't think it was butyl, because it was just too soft. But anyway, that can go in the bin, and it's being replaced with this as a skin fitting. So keep saying skin fitting, I mean cockpit drain. What's nice is this doesn't have a grill like this does, and these things always block up with peanuts, crisps, other detritus, leaves that get dropped down into the bottom of cockpits. So it's going to get swapped with this. And then we've got an elbow that's going to screw on the bottom, and that just directs the flow towards the seacocks, which makes it slightly easier to do the hoses afterwards. Now, because I am slightly fussy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to dry fit everything. This I know is already ever so slightly too big for the hole, so I'm just going to open it up with my multi-tool, with my little, I'm not going to say Dremel, with my Bosch rotary tool, and once that's in, I'm going to dry fit everything, do the nuts up on the back of this, and then work out where this wants to be. And I will probably end up trimming an inch or so off of this fitting here, so that the elbow is as high as possible, because it just makes moving around in the back of the boat slightly easier if you don't have lots of stuff hanging down. So
that is the plan.
There we go, I've just trimmed that. That's a nice snug fit. Hardly moves in the hole, which is what I like. So I'm going to stick the nut on the back and see how much of that thread I'm going to chop off. As you can see behind me, I've got that dry fitted now, and there is about 32 mil of thread showing. So I'm probably going to cut 25 mil off that, which is about an inch, just so that that doesn't hang down quite as far, and it will make a neater job of it once it's all fitted. And there's the deck drain in place. If you're wondering, that's the sealant that I generally use for this sort of thing, Sabertec. It works really, really well. It's very similar to Sikaflex, which a lot of people use, but I prefer this stuff. It's slightly easier to clean up, I find. And below decks, there is the rest of it. So that is just waiting for a hose, and I'll drop that hose back through the holes here in the hull because I haven't got the seacocks in yet. Whilst I use a normal kind of sealant on the fitting that goes through the deck, the metal fittings where they go together, so the elbow and the hose tail that will have to screw together, I use a thread sealant. I use this stuff, it's called Celestite, I think you pronounce it, and it is for metallic pipe work and equipment, thread sealant, for gas and water, and basically you stick it on the threads, you screw it together, and within 20 minutes, half an hour, it's cured and you've got a nice water and gas tight seal between those metal fittings. I've been using this for 3 or 4 years. It was recommended to me by one of my suppliers, and not had any issues at all, so it's well worth buying if you are putting together metal fittings on your boat. It's now the next day, and you can see I've been removing the very thin kind of engine sound insulation from both the sides there. I'm going to carry on with that so it is all clear of that nasty old stuff. I don't know whether there was a fire in the engine bay or something got very, very hot, but the stuff that was on here was really gooey and nasty. I'm not quite sure what that insulation is made from, but it's kind of like a tarry type stuff, and it's obviously gotten very, very hot at one stage, and it was a bit like scraping your treacle off there, but I can get that surface cleaned up so it can take some new sound insulation in due course. I think what I'm also going to do today is do some GRP repairs. So down there, that's just some temporary filler that I put in for where the old engine seacock was, so I need to grind that out, and I'm going to lay up some glass in there to repair that properly. But I've also got 1, 2, can't quite see it there, 3 and 4 further repairs to do there, which were for the old anode studs. So it had 2 very, very large anodes on the bottom of this boat, so I'm going to replace that with a single anode in due course, but the hole spacing on those old fixings was not going to be suitable for the anodes I'm going to fit, so I've glassed them up on the outside, and now I'm just going to grind them back and just lay up a little bit of glass on the inside. And then finally, I'm probably going to bond in the new stern tube through the void there. I've got a couple of tube heaters in the van, which I'm going to go and grab and stick in there just to warm everything up, and then I can bond those in, or at least do the initial bond, and get that in whilst I'm waiting for the foaming epoxy to arrive. If you're wondering, yes, I do sound croaky again. I just don't seem to be able to shake this cold or whatever it is that I've had this last 2 to 3 weeks. It's just been driving me nuts. I'm very, very bored of feeling unwell now. I'm not quite unwell enough to not work, but I am unwell enough to not work kind of full days at the moment. So I guess that's just living in the UK at this time of year. There's lots of bugs going around. So wish me luck that I continue to get better, because I want to go sailing this weekend. It's Wednesday today, and I've got another 2 days to try and get right so that I can go over to Cowes and meet up with some friends over there. As is often the case when you're working on old boats, you never quite know what you're going to find, and I removed the rest of the sound insulation from in the engine bay, and I found a hole through the side of the engine compartment into kind of where the batteries are, although it's not exactly into where the batteries are, it's kind of aft of the batteries, and it looks like the hole has been cut by a blind man with a chainsaw. So I'm just making a piece of wood to block it off. This is what I discovered, just covered over with a piece of kind of 2mm thick sound insulation, and yeah, it's not very pretty. I'm not entirely sure what it was for. The only thing I can think is that it might have been for some ducting for a heater. So I've just cut a piece of 15mm plywood and shaped it so that it's just going to blank that off, and then that will all get covered by sound insulation once I put that back in. I've just ground out also around the little repairs that I need to do up there, those 4, but I'm yet to do that one. I'm afraid the dust got the better of me, so I had to take a break from creating dust in a small environment. I have been a fairly busy bee in the engine compartment, so I've blanked off that rather large and ugly hole that was in the side there. I have put some framing around the new hatch, which I cut yesterday or the day before, so the hatch, when it goes back in there, has something to kind of rest up against. More importantly, I have done the initial bond on the new stern tube, so that's just been bogged in both through the hull and through that kind of mini bulkhead there. And then once that has cured, I'm going to lay some glass up between the hull and the stern tube as well, just to make sure it's absolutely secure. I would show you what it looks like down in the hull, but I've got tube heaters in there at the moment because I want to keep everything nice and warm so that it all cures properly. I've also just done a little bit of a grind, so done a bit of prep work on those old fixing holes that were glassed from the outside and filled, and the same for the old seacock. So I've just ground that back, so I'm going to cut some little circles of glass up and then lay some glass into those holes just to finish them off. I've just finished up putting the glass on the patches in the engine bay, and whilst I was doing that, I had a delivery. So first of all, quick shout out to these guys, East Coast Fiberglass or ECF Composites. I use them for quite a lot of stuff, buying glass, buying other bits and bobs, consumables and what have you. No relationship with them whatsoever. They don't sponsor me, but they're nice guys to deal with. They give good advice, and I find them really convenient because I order stuff in the evening when they're closed. Just log onto their website and order what I need to do, and it turns up the next day or the day after, depending on what shipping I use. But anyway, in here, hopefully, should be the foaming epoxy. So we'll have a little look and see what they've sent me. Some paperwork, a load of packing, and there we go. So it's Sycamin is the name of the stuff. PB250, Sycamin PB250. So this is the foaming epoxy that I plan to use. I've got 3 of these packs. I think each pack is 600 grams worth, and I think it expands to 4 times its original size, and I wasn't quite sure what the volume was that I needed in the thing, so I suspect I need 2, but I've bought 3 because I guarantee if I only buy 2, I'll definitely need 3. So if it doesn't get used up on this, I'm sure it'll get used up on other projects, because sometimes you use this for filling voids in rudders and that sort of thing as well. So I've not personally used this product before, so it's going to be a bit of an experiment. I shall probably mix up some in a cup and just see how it works tomorrow, and then all going well, I will fill up the void with the foam. It's now the next day, and the glass that I laid up in here has all cured, and the stern tube as well affixed. So what I think I'm going to do next is come back in and prep that for some glass just around the stern tube. The stern tube is slightly too long at the moment, so I will be chopping that down, but I'll leave it over length just for now. And back there, where those tube heaters are, I think what I'm going to do is come in and prep that so that I can place over the top of that hole a thin piece of plywood, which is what it had before. And then with that loosely bogged in, I'm going to cut some holes in the top of it, and then I can pour the foam through those holes. And then once that foam has gone off, I'll then glass over the top of that triangle of plywood. So that'll all be then fully secured and back as it was. So I'm going to have to go and suit up now and get in there and start prepping that area to put a piece of plywood in. I have just spent quite a bit of time grinding back the fiberglass in the area above the skeg, so that is looking reasonable, and I'm able to bond in a piece of plywood over the top. So here's my piece of plywood. I'm going to shove this in, and might need a tiny bit more trimming, but the plan is to bog that in, and I'll drill a couple of holes in it before I do that, and then I'm going to let that cure overnight tonight, and then tomorrow I will pour in the foam from above, and once that's all cured I can then glass over the top of that piece of plywood up the whole sides, and then it's pretty much job done in terms of the skeg. There's the plywood top I've cut up, stuck a couple of holes in, and I've just bogged that in on thickened epoxy. What I'm going to do next is just lay up a little bit of glass to tie the back edge of that plywood into the hull, and then also lay up a little bit of glass between the hull and the stern tube. It's a bit belt and braces, but I don't see any harm in doing exactly that. That's as much glass as I'm going to put in on that stern tube. So there are 3 layers of glass just between the stern tube and the hull, and then a further 2 layers just going over the edge of the plywood just to help tie the back edge of that into the hull. Once that's all foam filled, I'll lay up quite a few layers of glass probably over the top of that plywood, because I think it's probably a bit like the keel in that you need some glass coming across the top there just to add some structure in and to stop the skeg from kind of wobbling around, so it just probably helps support it a little bit as well. So maybe 3, 4, 5 layers of glass will go over the top of that just to tie the 2 sides of the hull together. So that I'm not using this foaming epoxy for the very first time when I stick it in the void above the skeg, I'm going to mix some up now just to see how it performs and how it expands, and just check everything's all good with it, just because I've never used this product before. So there's supposed to be 100 grams of this and 36 grams of the second part. Mix them together and there you have foaming epoxy. So I'm actually going to do half that amount because I don't want to waste it. So I'm going to put 50 grams in of this to start with. Got my scales, which are covered in all manner of different resins and bits and pieces. Alright, I've just zeroed that, and I'll put 50 grams in, which is going to be a fairly small amount. That's 25. $44. 46, 47, 48, 49. I'll just drop a little bit more in there. 50. There we go. Excuse me, I'm still not well, but I am getting better. Right, that's 50 grams of that. What did I say? 36 of this one, didn't I? I'm just going to double check. Yeah, DM2, that's DM2, so 36. Half 36 is 18. So I'm going to zero that. And this is much more liquid. Four, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 14, 15, 16, 8, 17, 17, nearly there, just need a tiny little drop. 18. I'll just get that drip for there onto a clean bit of spatula. Right, mix this together and we'll see what happens. I don't know how long it takes to start foaming, and it's not super warm in here at the moment, so I mean, it's just about warm enough to do work with epoxy. It's probably about 15 degrees C. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit because I'm not an American, so sorry about that. As always with epoxy based products or any resin system, you need to give it a really good mix just to make sure the two components are completely mixed together. Scrape round the sides, scrape round the bottom, make sure you haven't missed any bits. And then sit and wait, I guess. Well, that is, I think, pretty well mixed. So, sit here and wait for it to do its thing. This is perhaps not terribly exciting to look at, but it appears that the foaming epoxy has done its thing in terms of it's foamed, and I've just been reading the technical data sheet, and it says that the foaming action happens initially relatively quickly, and then it has to do its cure like a normal epoxy would. So I'm just going to leave that overnight and let it do its thing. So I think it has expanded to 4 times its original size, which is what it said it would do, because I only put well, 50 grams plus 17 grams or whatever it was, so you know, 67 grams in the pot there. So that has now got you know, 150 milliliters of foam in there. So so it has expanded, and it's done its thing, so it should do its job. Having looked at the data sheet, it does say in there that ideally the foam wants a post-cure at 40 to 60 degrees C, which is going to be tricky in the skeg. But what I will probably be able to do is, once it's in there and it's all foamed and filled, I will be able to put a heater probably underneath the boat to warm up the skeg, and put another heater in the engine bay to get a nice bit of heat into the foam so that it does a proper cure. So that's the plan. Anyway, we'll try it out tomorrow. I was just setting up a heater out here on that rather Heath Robinson stack of wooden blocks because I want to get some heat into the void at the top of the skeg. Whilst I was doing that, I realised I hadn't actually shown you what was going on externally on the stern tube. So here it is. When it was bogged in, it was put in on thickened epoxy with silica, which gives a really hard material that ultimately I can drill and tap into, because I've got to put a cutlass bearing in there, and I will drill and tap a couple of holes, one each side, to hold the cutlass bearing in place. Now the brown stuff that's on top of that is a little bit of fairing compound that I've just put in on top of that harder material just to fair it all in nicely. Now that will get a coat of this grey High Protect when it's all done, but I will get everything ready and completely finished before I put that High Protect on. Back in the engine bay, and that glass I put in yesterday is all cured, which is good. I've obviously got the tube heaters you can see at the back there, and with the heating going on the hull externally, I should be getting a reasonably warm void for me to pour that foaming epoxy into. So I think that's the next thing I am going to do, and then I can keep an eye on how it expands whilst I'm doing some other work in here. Here's the foaming epoxy that I made yesterday just to do my test. It has cured to some extent. It's still slightly soft. If you see, I can kind of push my finger into it, so I think it definitely needs that extra heat to do its post-cure, which I can achieve in there. It's also possibly it hasn't fully cured because it was pretty cold last night, and whilst I had some background heating in here, it probably wasn't quite warm enough for it to achieve a full cure. So I'm definitely going to have to leave the heating on in the skeg just to get this to achieve a cure. I'm going to check the technical data sheet again just to have a look at the temperature requirements, but it shouldn't be an issue. It just needs a bit more heat. Now, in theory, I should be able to stick that whole tin in my mixing pot and that whole bottle in the mixing pot, and it should be the right quantities, but I'm going to use my scales anyway, just to make absolutely certain that what I'm putting in there is the right quantities according to the instructions. That's my pot of foaming epoxy all mixed up. This is already expanding in the pot, so I need to go and chuck this in the hole rapidly before it gets too excited. Now, doing this with a camera is not going to be terribly easy, so you may or may not get a very good shot. There we go. That is the first lot in the hole. I apologise for the poor quality of that footage. It is very difficult to hold a camera phone and hold a pot of foaming epoxy and pour it into a small hole without making a mess or dropping the camera, or yeah, just it's not easy. So I've put the first lot of foaming epoxy in there, and I'm going to mix up another batch and chuck it in exactly the same way. Well, sometimes I do get things wrong, and I'm happy to admit that I'm definitely not perfect. I have poured all of the foaming epoxy that I have got into the void, and I didn't buy enough. But let me show you how far up the void it's got. So what I'm doing, just for the sake of this shot, is I've put my little rechargeable light shining it through the top hole, and that means if I get that close enough, you can see through the bottom hole. Now, there's the foaming epoxy, and it is filled probably 2/3 or maybe 3/4 of the void, but not quite enough to completely fill it. The critical part of this was making sure that foaming epoxy got all around the new stern tube that I bonded in, because I wanted that to be absolutely secure in the void in there. So that has been achieved. So I've just got to decide what to do, really. I can buy some more of that foaming epoxy and pour it in. It's reasonably expensive. So what I'm kind of tempted to do is to let that cure, and then on top of it, just to continue filling up that void, use some much cheaper and much more readily available polyurethane foam in there. I can't think of a reason why I wouldn't want to do that. That's the stuff that was in there before. Admittedly, it got very wet, but that's because the old stern tube was leaking. Now, the old stern tube was metal, the new one is glass fibre, so it's much less likely that there's going to be an issue with the bonding breaking down between the stern tube and the hull. So I think it's highly unlikely that water will get back into that void. And even if it does, the foam that is around the stern tube is the epoxy foam, not any other foam. So I'm very, very tempted to put polyurethane foam in the top of there. So I'm going to cogitate on that for a little while, because I'm not going to put anything more in there until that has fully cured. And in the meantime, I'm going to start templating for a new bulkhead to replace the one that I cut out, because I want to have a bulkhead that goes all the way up to the bottom of the cockpit sole. I'm going to put some temporary fixings in just to hold that in place, and then I can use my joggle stick like I did in a previous episode to work out how I need to extend that bulkhead to make it fit properly both at the top, so I can glass it into the bottom of the floor in the cockpit, and to maybe make it fit a little bit better at the bottom here, where it's a little bit of a rough fit down there. It's pretty gappy. So well, that's what I'm doing next. That's what I call my joggle stick. I use it to take the shape that I need to make a bulkhead to. If you are interested in seeing me use it, then you'll have to watch my last video where I use it to make up a template for a floor. And you can see there I've drawn around that joggle stick all the way around this old bulkhead, because it means that I can extend the joggle stick out to the edges of the hull and the deck, and I can work out what size I need the new bulkhead to be. So I can now take that piece of plywood, I'm going to walk off to the workshop with it and transfer that onto a nice new piece of plywood, and bring that back down to the boat to trial fit it. There you have the old bulkhead, which was my template, and underneath, if I whip that up, you have the new bulkhead. So I'm going to chuck that in and see how it fits. Now, I'm not going to say it didn't take a little bit more trimming, but that's fairly normal. But the bulkhead that is going to go back in there is all cut and ready to go back in. But of course it can't go back in until I've finished behind there. So I had a conversation with the owner a very short while ago about how we're going to finish in the engine bay. We were talking about painting it, but because of the amount of prep work to get a decent paint finish in there, we've decided that actually we may as well spend the time with me in there with the angle grinder, cleaning it all up and making it look nice, removing all the old paint and then flow coating it. So that is what's going to happen next. I think I'm going to climb in there, suit it up, angle grinder and the flap disc, and remove the grotty old paint that's kind of all through here until I get back to nice clean glass. I'm probably going to remove those metal engine bearers before I do that as well, just to make access slightly easier. And through the magic of video editing and not having to watch me do it, and certainly not having to do it, that's the inside of the engine bay, all ground back, so it's pretty close to a surface that can be finished now once all the seacocks and everything else and the bonding that I need to do in there is all done. As you can probably imagine, or maybe experience, grinding polyester is not a particularly nice experience, and I've got it in my ears and everywhere, and I need to go and jump in the shower. But that does also bring us to the end of this episode, because I want to get it out for you to watch this weekend. I'm going sailing this weekend, which is going to be fantastic. Do give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. I will continue making Project Lottie videos, and I've got some other boat works coming up as well on different boats in the next few months. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to make a comment or ask a question down in the comments, I do read every single comment that comes in. So thank you very much for those who do post comments. I really appreciate it. And I try and answer as many questions as I can. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.